Professor Ramose, what a great pleasure to be with you here at this symbolic site in the Freedom Park here in Pretoria. I'm really very, very glad to be here with you, and particularly glad for us to engage in a conversation which will be a very informal conversation about mutual concerns. Concerns that you have been exposing in your books, that I have been exposing in my books. I come from a different trajectory. You are a philosopher, I'm a sociologist. I come from Europe, came from Africa. But in any case, we have been developing ideas and concerns that show that we are really converging into some kinds of ideas concerned as we are with emancipatory politics, with the liberation of people. And I think that our conversation should focus a little bit on that. I want to thank you for this occasion, for us to be here. And of course, I would start, we are going to be very informal as usual, very informal conversation. But you have been a very, and you are a very important philosopher here in Southern Africa. And you have been one of the most distinguished philosophers emphasizing the idea that there is an African philosophy. That is to say, there is not philosophy in Africa, but there is African philosophy. And as you know, this is a contentious concept. There are many colleagues of yours that dispute that. One of our colleagues that, in fact, with whom I had already a conversation, Professor Mudimbe, for instance, disputes that idea. And I would like you to start, just for a start, then we'll move on to all kinds of things. Why do you think that there is an African philosophy when in one of your texts you say that Africa is usually no more than a footnote or an afterthought? So Africa has not been able to speak for itself or for herself. I would like you to start the conversation precisely on this topic because I think it's crucial to your way of thinking.
Thank you, Professor Boaventura. I also would like to thank you. Really thank you for inviting me to these very important conversations. I appreciate very much the initiative that you have taken so that we indeed become involved in conversations. Mm-hmm. Somehow it reminds me, of course, of Marcel Griol's conversations with Ogotomeli. Mm-hmm. But maybe, but I like the term conversations. Mm-hmm. I also like to thank you for making it possible for us to be here in a way that we can discuss in quite an informal way. And I appreciate this informality around what we will be talking in our conversation. It is important for me really to start with a lot of disputable and disputed issues when one wants to answer the question, is there an African philosophy? Well, one of the points I want to start with is that evolutionary biology, archaeology, whatever you call it, suggests very strongly that the human being as we know today originates from this continent. So, I mentioned that these are still disputable issues, but you know, always there is a reason for dispute. Sometimes it may just be because of self-interest to pursue a particular dispute. So I want to have this point noted, that I do take seriously the point that in spite of the disputes, we can say, or I should like to align myself with the view that the human being as we know today originates from this continent. It is no surprise, therefore, that, for example, you will find a text under the title, The African Exodus. You can see even the biblical significance of that. But we're not talking the Bible except to mention that this idea of exodus from Africa is quite serious. And the fact that this text is quite of recent origin does tell us something about the scientific advances as far as this argument is concerned. So that is my first point about where exactly does the human being originate. Second, well, Africa is, as I argue in my writings, actually a baptismal name that has been given to the peoples of Africa.
In fact, you write that you write Africa under protest.
Precisely, precisely under protest.
Why is
because, you see, Professor, it is clear that if a parent gives a name to its child, the presumption is that the parent has got the power to do so. Similarly, the one who baptizes and gives the name also has the power to do so. To imagine that in terms of disputed history anyway, because history for me is his story.
Of course.
It is yet to become her story, and finally it must become our story.
Okay.
So from that point of view, I want to say that precisely because the one who baptized the continent Africa baptized it by virtue of a certain power. That
Means that Africa had already a name before that. Which was that?
In fact, this is the crucial point, because when you consider that the Romans and the Greeks just baptized the north of the continent as Africa, the question remains, how and why did this name spread to the rest of the continent?
Absolutely.
I'm still interested in an historian who would actually give an explanation to this. But the point is that where there is power, especially violent, unjustified use of power, just as the Romans and the Greeks were violent in their conquest of these regions of Africa, those who subsequently conquered Africa were also invoking unjustified use of violence in order to establish themselves and their epistemological paradigms in this continent. So Africa is a baptismal name.
You see, you are aware, I'm sure you are aware, Professor Ramose, that the indigenous people in Latin America and in the Americas make that point as well.
Exactly.
But they have a name. That Abiyala is there even today. In many of the meetings, the indigenous people refuse to use America or Latin America and use instead Abiyala, which was the name of that area before the conquerors.
True. And you see, because it has got so many regions and so many communities, what I'm suggesting is that the peoples of Africa do have the linguistic, cultural, and sociological resources to come up with a democratically decided name for the continent. The resources are there linguistically, culturally they are there. Now, because of this conquest and assimilation of false truths, we still use the name, some of us under protest. So the point I'm making is that yes, like even in New Zealand, they have their own name.
That's right.
For, you see,
that's right.
Exactly. So the point I'm getting at is because of the size and the diversity in the continent, now that we are facing this as a problem, if we really want to take it seriously, surely we cannot doubt our linguistic and cultural resources for us to come up with a name that will be acceptable to all of us. And that, for me, is not only a matter of democracy, it's also a question of justice. It will correct the problem of justice that we still live under. The name Africa speaks to the point for me that the problem of justice that we have still has to be resolved.
And that's very interesting because, in a sense, behind and underlying all your philosophy, as I understand, and your text and so on, is the idea of historical injustice. That is to say, the first premise, we'll move on later on this topic, but it looks like it is very important that social injustice and all other injustices that exist in the world, for you, the historical one is absolutely matricial one, is the basic, underlying all the other injustices, probably.
It is very basic because it has also to do with the question of memory. And memory also is related to the question of truth. For me, truth and justice are inseparable concepts. When you talk truth, you cannot talk it without at the same time talking justice. Of course, I don't want to anticipate, but you and I are aware that, in fact, when it comes to South Africa, for example, the TRC, it is called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The word justice is nowhere in the title. And that's very interesting and not least problematical. In any case, the point is that power has given us the name Africa and not ourselves. When we finally decide in the name of justice and democracy on a name that is our own, we will be recognizing ourselves as animals with reason. Not only animals with reason, but animals which can use reason in many ways, focused also on the problem of justice. Now, animals with reason are animals which are capable of wonder, of surprises, of curiosity. And if wonder and curiosity belong to the element of what we call philosophy, generally speaking, philosophia as love of wisdom.
Of course.
Surely, Africa, given the antiquity of humanity here, Africa then had and continues to have philosophy. It had. So we cannot say that the peoples of Africa have not the capacity to wonder at things.
How do you see yourself in this? It's not a competition or a struggle, but it's really a movement to define the specific characteristics of African philosophy. Because if there is an African philosophy, then we have to distinguish it from European philosophy, from American philosophy, from Asian philosophy. Must have some specificity. And I'd like to know whether you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, I think we must be clear. That's why I speak of philosophia in general as love of wisdom. That one is really open to everyone who is human, wherever they may be. But philosophy as a technical discipline is a different issue. And that is generally where the contestation is lodged. Now, the problem is that when one studies the contestations, one discovers that, no, you see, at one stage, it is philosophia which is on the table. At another stage, it is philosophy, I like your word, discipline, as a discipline. Now, philosophy as a discipline, we must remember, is a construct. It's a pure construct.
Absolutely.
And because it is a construct, We have to contest. I want to go back to your word again. You used the word universal philosophy. This
It's not my term, but the term that
Exactement,
is
oui,
used.
yes, I get it. But you see, this idea that philosophy is universal is a subtle, almost inadvertent admission that those who have the power to create oneness out of pluriversality. So that already is a point of contestation for me. By virtue of what power do they really can say philosophy is universal? Philosophy, given the fact that it arises from the living conditions of human experience. That is where it rises from. It arises from the living conditions of human experience. Surely, when I live in Ghana, my experience is not absolutely the same as the experience of someone living in Uganda or in South Africa. By virtue of this experiential diversity, different questions will arise and also different answers. And so, if we want to fit this into the concept of philosophy as a discipline, especially as a discipline constructed unilaterally in the name of universality,
And
that is really the critical point.
And that's why you have to adjectivize it, because the discipline is constrained, is constraining, and therefore, in order to keep that term, we have to adjectivize African, European, Asian, Latin America. That's the only way to work within this idea, which I absolutely agree with you, that is the discipline in itself, by arrogating itself to be that particular kind of way of knowledge, being the philosophy and the discipline of philosophy. Because for me, in fact, philosophy or knowledge in general is a reflection on the ways in which we can experience the world as our own.
Exactly.
And very often, these philosophies, there were alien philosophies, so to say, as disciplines. We are talking about disciplines that were transposed through colonialism to the rest of the world. They don't allow the people to experience their own world as their own.
That's it.
And therefore, if the world is not experienced as their own, of course, they cannot transform it in their own terms, in their own name. So I agree with you, and that's where there is a convergence between us in here, that in fact this claim for knowledge, claim for philosophizing and the need to make the world our own is absolutely crucial. But then the question comes, and that is very interesting in your work, that on one side you look at this Africa, let's take Africa, the name is there. We already have said and mentioned this is a baptismal type of name. The name is there, we have not invented one yet, another one. But in any case, there is this quest for authenticity there. But on one side, you are very keen in your texts to underline the diversity of African experiences. You just mentioned that. You know, different countries, different ethnic groups, different regions, they have different experiences of the world, and therefore, nevertheless, there is something, a thin line that unites them, and that allows us to speak of African philosophy. So that's precisely that line that unites all this diversity that I'd like you to elaborate a little bit.
Yes. The first line, you know, history, as I said, is problematical. For example, you have a very strange concept called prehistory. Of course, that is a nice way of saying the period about which we know nothing. And of course, you can call it. In other words, now, after history becomes a discipline, we can talk sense, as if there was no sense before. Okay. Now, having said that, I want to say that one of the lines that we must recognize is that, for example, the Sahara Desert is surely not the birthmark of Africa, like the navel of a baby. The Sahara Desert grew in time before it expanded. We must recognize that the peoples of Africa were interacting as one. That is quite serious. The Namib, these deserts are geographical divides that come later, but they, by coming into being, they do not obliterate the cultural contacts that have been there before. Now, one line that emerges out of these cultural lines is the line which I like to call humanness.
Humanness, yes.
Over here.
As opposed to humanism.
Exactly. Humanness is not the same thing as humanism. I must admit that in reading some of the philosophical texts by our African sisters and brothers, one notices that a distinction is not always made between speaking English and writing philosophy. That is why sometimes you find that this humanness is simply conveyed as humanism.
Okay, Professor Ramose, as I was saying, we are entering a topic, the topic of Ubuntu, which is one of the words or concepts most talked about, probably misunderstood, probably abused. And it is not a unique phenomenon in Africa, because some of my work in Latin America, I work a lot with indigenous peoples movement, and the indigenous peoples have, in the process of their struggles, they have managed to bring to the political agenda catch-all words, that is to say, non-colonial concepts, or concepts that are not expressed in colonial languages. And they say and they claim that translation, absolute translation is impossible. We can approximately see what does it mean or not. One of the most famous concepts is the concept of summa causa, which in Quechua means good living. Not living better, good living, buen vivir in Spanish. And I wrote about that. Many people have been writing about that. The indigenous peoples write about that. But I think that we are coming to an age in which these concepts, which is part of the struggles, I would think even of a new wave of decolonial thinking, the process that we are in a sense decolonizing the social sciences, decolonizing philosophy. These concepts that in the past were just exoticisms, now they become part of the struggle. They become serious concepts in philosophy or social sciences, and they become part of the struggle. For instance, summa causa now is in the Equatorian Constitution as a concept, a Quechua concept. In Africa, we have Ubuntu. So I'm not claiming that I'll be understanding everything very deeply, what you are going to say, but what I promise is that I will be listening deeply, as you say in one of your texts. So I'll be listening deeply. Let's sit down and have our conversation on Ubuntu, and then I'll ask some issues as I feel fit.
Yes, thank you, Prof. That was, of course, the first line. I will mention in parentheses the second line, and then I come back to Ubuntu. The second line is the line of the commonly shared experience of colonization. Now, I say commonly shared with qualification, because some of Africa was colonized by the French, another part by the Portuguese, another by the English. Let us not forget that even Islam has a role. So, what I want to say is that even if I say commonly, I recognize that the experience that Francophone Africa can have of colonization will be different from the experience that those of us who were colonized by the English have, will be different from. But what is a common thread is that we were colonized. Okay, now we can talk about that later, but it is an important experience. Now getting to Ubuntu, I see that you also make an important reference to the point that, you know, these indigenous concepts have for a long time been suppressed, silenced, and excluded. Again, that is the reason of power. That is the so-called right of conquest, which made that possible. I should like to make preliminary remarks which pertain to your input on this point. One of the remarks is that you mentioned that one of the indigenous concepts is already part of the constitution in one of the Latin American countries. Well, let us consider this. By some accident, I followed some legal studies in South Africa, although I didn't complete that, but I did that in the University of South Africa. One of our textbooks written by eminent jurists, namely Professors Hallo and Khan, is called the South African Legal System and Its Background. I think I want to repeat the title, the South African Legal System and Its Background. Well, this is a text of more than 600 pages. I found it very interesting that even a study of all the footnote references in the text, not once will you find the word Bantu, let alone Ubuntu. So it struck me, I began to ask, what is the South African legal system and its background? The people in South Africa, the Bantu-speaking peoples, the San and the Khoi peoples, hardly form a footnote, let alone part of the main text, just a footnote. So, what does this mean? Well, you know, a text of 600 pages plus, to forget that raises more questions than it answers.
Of course.
I thought that, oh, maybe that was accidental. So I studied other texts, also around 600 pages plus, on South African legal philosophy. Again, no Bantu, no Ubuntu. Wow. And finally, I got a textbook prescribed at the University of Pretoria in one of their departments in law. I looked, searching for footnotes, very specifically searching for Bantu or Ubuntu. This is very recent. No Ubuntu, no Bantu. Now we come to your point about the Constitution. So informal studies. The Bantus are not there, even if they are in this country. So we are here, but we are not technically present. Well, come the Constitution with all the euphoria around it, you find two parts of the Constitution. The 1993 one, which is the British Constitution, and of course the 1996 one, Act 108 of 1996. Well, in the one of 1993, you do indeed find the term Ubuntu. But since we are talking disciplines, like we were talking the discipline of philosophy, I think we also have to talk the discipline of law here. According to standard teaching we had at the time, in terms of interpretation of statutes, we were taught that what appears in the preamble or the postamble is certainly not part of the law. It is only a kind of ornament. You put salt into what you have, but you may not take it seriously as far as the law is concerned. And exactly that is where you find Ubuntu in the postamble. It's just nice footnote, not having any serious technical significance. Now, this is at the time, if I may borrow the terminology from history of Western evolution of ideas, this is now the time of enlightenment in South Africa. Of course, it's not just an accidental borrowing, because even at the time, there were arguments, especially in the Afrikaner community. So they described the other one group as verkrampt and the other one as verlicht. So they were enlightened. So even by the time of enlightenment, the Bantu or Ubuntu became just a footnote. We do not exist. Well, that was in the 1993 Constitution. Come the 1996 Constitution, which is supposed to be final, Ubuntu is nowhere to be found. Nowhere. So you have to ask yourself the question, is it really collective amnesia that all who were involved in so-called negotiations just simply forgot that at least Ubuntu appeared just as an ornament? Now this final constitution doesn't need ornaments anymore. We just will go straight to the heart of the matter. So you see, Professor, Ubuntu by itself has got a problem. And how does the judiciary solve this problem of deliberate exclusion of Ubuntu? I cannot talk the language of, oh, you know, this was collective accidental amnesia. I doubt it very much. That is why I prefer to describe it as deliberate exclusion.
But you have an argument that goes even further than that. One is to say that this is a deliberate exclusion. The other is to say that if the name were there and would mean something, the Constitution wouldn't be like the one that we have now.
Slowly we're getting there.
But before getting there, that's what I think that I want you to explain a bit more. In order to get to that eventual conclusion, what is in fact Ubuntu? When the Ubuntu was in play, what is prior to the Constitution, prior to many of all these discussions, prior to all these books on jurisprudence, there is, in your view, Ubuntu as a living philosophical concept of the Bantu people in this region of the world. Explain to me what is it? Some people say, well, Ubuntu is I am because you are. Look at this. Or others go to quasi biredu, life is mutual aid, or something like that. That would be also similar to Ubuntu. I don't think that satisfies you.
No, it doesn't satisfy me, for sure.
Tell me then.
You see, this is what I meant by talking English and talking philosophy.
Okay.
Also, there is the tendency, and I'm glad you mentioned that already, for example, to say Ubuntu is I am because we are. You give a definition, which of course even Martin Buber can be said to have had.
Absolutely. Ishondu.
Exactly. What is it? Some people say Ubuntu is respect for other people. Well, even if you're not an Ubuntu adherent and you live in Brazil or in New Zealand, you would still have the idea that respect for other people is good. Ubuntu is you may not kill others. That is cataloging. It is not philosophizing. It is just grabbing catalogs. Catalog. You give a catalog, but the problem is that when you present this catalog, you present it in definitional terms because you say Ubuntu is. So you're claiming that you're defining. And yet, what you're doing is just to draw from general experience and then you attach to Ubuntu. Let us look at it from a different angle, the angle of non-catalog, the angle of philosophical discourse. When we look at it from that point of view, noting indeed your great submission that anyway you don't command the language, we accept that. We very much appreciate the fact that as a scientist, whether a sociologist or a philosopher, you are prepared to listen. Now, this Ubuntu, of course, belongs in the category of Bantu languages to the Nguni-speaking group. The same type of word we use in the Sotho-speaking group. We say Butu. You see, when you cross the boundaries to go to Zimbabwe, same concept, but it will be called Hunu because they speak Shona. And so you can expand even into Kiswahili. So what is interesting about this is that from a philosophical point of view, you have a compound word. You have Ubu on one side and Ntu on the other side. If you break down this word, even in Sotho languages, Bo and Tu. So, you see, it is not only the point of linguistic exercise that is at issue here, it is also the question of philosophical, conceptual analysis. Okay. And so you find that when you look at this Ubu, or Hu in Shona, when you look just at this Ubu, there is nothing sure at all. Ubu is the highest level of generality in ontological terms. In ontological terms, in the terms of being. Because you can say Ubu, and instead of conjoining it with Ntu, the same Ubu, you can conjoin it with something like Hlungu. It can become Ubuhlungu, pain. You see, you can conjoin it with so many others. What remains, that is why I call it the highest level of generality in ontological terms. Because this Ubu stands free ontologically to be coupled with so much. That is one aspect about it. The second aspect is this one, and this is philosophically crucial. It is the point that precisely because it is Ubu, it is hanging, it is in motion, it is in permanent suspense of being. In other words, the philosophical point of departure for Ubuntu will be motion and not rest. Of course, a Western-trained philosopher will say, wow, Heraclitus already declared that, Pantarei, everything is in motion. Well, we don't talk copyright of reasoning. if Heraclitus thought about it,
Of course.
it doesn't follow that no other human being has even thought about it before Heraclitus. If we take seriously into account my initial point as we were walking, that if the human being as we know actually originated from here, then Heraclitus is a lad of yesterday. And so we cannot immediately jump and say, but Heraclitus said, we rather can acknowledge a coincidence of philosophical insights.
If not even its source.
Precisely, if not even its source. So, therefore, we don't have only in ontological terms, we don't have only the highest level of generality, we have also the principle, the recognition that when you look at Ubu, you recognize that being is being. That's why in my writings, I write being with hyphen. It is not accident. It is not because I speak English. It is because I speak philosophy that I write it as an hyphenated word. And I compare it with being, which I also write as a normal English. But if one has followed the reasoning, one can see why this one is being and the other one is being. All right. Now, because of the multiple possibilities of coupling ubu with any, when you couple it with ntu, you couple it with something that is normative, in the sense that it has also an ontological reference point. And how do you arrive at an ontological reference point? Now, ubu is like many other words in our languages. It is like umu. One can say, for example, umu and uwat, umlungu, meaning a white person, right? But umu can also be coupled with ntu. And this is where I'm going. When you couple it with ntu, it becomes umuntu, an ontologically, empirically recognizable being which we call a human being. Now, this human being shares something in common with the ntu of Ubuntu, because we have the same suffix, right? So having the same suffix means there is somehow inside identity there. And this one goes to the direction of umuntu, must have, in the ethical sense. And therefore, I will prefer even the word umuntu ought to have Ubuntu. You see, that's why I call it normative. Ubuntu is normative because its point of reference is Umuntu. And Umuntu has got the obligation to become ethical. Any Umuntu who is not ethical is said to be a thing. We don't mean literally you are a thing. We see that you are a human being. But we will even use terms like kisilo asemutu silose. When you say, it denies that. You say hasemutu silose. It means you are not a human being. You are really this thing. Now, to be a human being is to be a muntu. And that is when you can come with what precisely does it mean to be ethical from the perspective of Ubuntu? It is exactly when you have established this foundation that you can come to begin to reason the ethical question, what does it mean? Now, this Ubuntu and Umuntu, being subject to the principle of motion, will have to evolve an ethics that speaks to attunement to being in motion.
But your formulation, in English at least, sounds very much like an individualistic metaphysics, because you are talking about oneself, one. Who is this one? That is to say, Ubuntu appeals to an ontology that you, in one of your texts, you say is an ontology of visible and invisible beings, the living dead, and not yet born. When you say that he or she is being truthful, he or she is what? I think that Ubuntu has a connection here with the priority of the community through which this very enfolded generality becomes constructed in real life and in concrete action, which is the suffix, is the one that has to be constructed in a kind of a community type of life, which originally, at least in many continents, this ontological community is very proper of the rural areas, which some people may question that when people are moving to the urban areas, do they take Ubuntu with them? Do they keep this truthfulness in the same ways and with some ethical references? I don't know if I think myself understood, but I would like you to address community individual, not as a polarization, would be another Western dichotomy, but how are they embedded in your thinking?
Yes. You see, community is slightly a big jump because this being and being means fundamentally relationality. So, even for example, Bujo is shifting from that. He actually writes, he uses the Latin expression, cognatus ergo sum. I am related, therefore we are. So you see, being is already in ontological terms. In ontological terms, being is already the ontological context of relationality.
It's a co-being.
Exactly, co-being. Not only with human beings only, but even, if I may use the expression, with nature in general. I say if I may use because the human being is still part of nature anyway.
Of course.
Exactly. So if we look at it that way, that this is being is co-being. It is relationality. Now, out of this relationality, in action with and through others, a community is born. That's why I would say a community is slightly of a big jump if we don't stress the relationality at the ontological level.
The community is the process of the construction of this relationality.
Exactly.
It's not a given.
It's not a given. A community is not a given. It is a construction of arising out of this relationality, and therefore, because it is a construction, it demands ethical principles. It demands Ubuntu. So, when we look at it that way, one sees that, here we now have a situation in which we cannot speak, and I'm glad you already noted that, we cannot speak of the dominance of the community over the individual, or we cannot even describe the Ubuntu perspective as individualistic. We cannot, simply because being brings about beings, and beings must look at one another. Beings must interact with one another. And in that interaction, something is born, which is a community with an ethics that is constructed from time to time, recognizing that it will change because conditions do not remain the same. What will not change is the demand for truth and the demand for justice in the construction of this. So, if I leave my tribal, rural community and I go to what is called an urban area, whatever else happens there, I am still going to be sensitive to the demands of truth and the demands of justice. To be in an urban environment does not by itself exempt anybody, even the people who were born in urban areas. They have no ontological or existential exemption to actually not be bothered by justice and truth. I referred already to the exclusions of Ubuntu. And I did mention, like you rightly point out in some of my writings, that no, you know, this is not just the exclusion of the word. It is also the exclusion of a people and their philosophy. Now, the dominant philosophy in this country, for example, and which is also operational in terms of economic globalization. The dominant philosophy is exactly what I just mentioned. Thou shalt kill, but in a civilized way. This is what we have. So if you were to include Ubuntu in the Constitution with its philosophical temperament and normative demands, you would not have this as a basic point of departure. You would not have thou shalt kill. Never. First of all, you will not have that because it is just not the ethical norm from which we begin. So you would not have that. So because you would not have that, you would be confronting another epistemological paradigm. And this confrontation would have to be resolved. Are we taking Ubuntu in order to promote, respect, and protect human life? Or are we taking liberalism with its liberal capitalism with its consequence and first principle being thou shalt kill under assumedly, I don't say the situations is really civilized, no. But you know, I use civilized in inverted commas. You know, for me, this way is really, we have provided with a jungle, but under the guise of civilization, where killing is permitted indiscriminately. And this you would not have had under Ubuntu, one. Second thing that you would not have had under Ubuntu, taking its point of departure as motion as the principle of being, is that you would not have a constitution posited as the supreme law of the country like we have here or in other countries. When the constitution as a supreme law is quite problematical because it has what in the legal discipline, you know, sometimes you have the essential features doctrine. If you don't have this, then you don't have it at all. You must have the philosophy knows how to critique essentialism. I will not go to that yet, except to make the point that when the Constitution stands as virtually, and I say virtually absolute and immutable, it runs directly contrary to the principle that everything is in motion. Why is it that the Constitution itself should not be in motion? You get my point. This fixation is an ism. That is why we see in English constitutionalism and not constitutionalness.
But Professor Ramos, there is a constitution because there is the state, because this priority, these Grundgesetz of the Grundnorm of the Constitution is as a primacy because there is a state which has the monopoly of the violence according to the Weberian conception. So in the end, for you, the state is inimical of Ubuntu. Ubuntu doesn't go together with the modern state. Because the state is fixity. The state is rigidity, is institutions, departments, laws, functionaries, staffs, and so on. So it's about fixity.
An
Ubuntu state is a contradiction in adjecto.
It sounds like a big jump, let me put it that way.
Okay.
When we take the constitutional history of this country, for example, you find that before 1993, the constitutional principle that ruled was the principle of parliamentary supremacy. So parliament was supreme. And that makes a lot of sense to me. It is still supreme in the UK, and it is still democratic. They simply, lately, after big debates on do we need a Bill of Rights, finally the UK has got enacted a Bill of Rights, which does not in any way, in the UK, for example, it does not in any way eradicate and exclude the principle of parliamentary supremacy.
But what difference does it make, a written or an unwritten constitution?
The British is unwritten.
I know.
Exactly.
What
and
is the
this
difference?
one, yes, I think the difference is more...
Because the written one is also able to be interpreted, and the Constitutional Court in South Africa has interpreted the Constitution sometimes in contradictory ways. I mean, it's also motion there.
Yes and no. You see, the British is unwritten, and yet it is interpretable by the courts. So I think the question of written is a matter of taste. What I'm getting at as a matter of principle and justice is the following, that for more than 300 years, parliamentary supremacy was the constitutional principle that ruled South Africa. You see, so the question is not, do you need or don't you need a constitution? It says, what constitutional principle do you put in place? Parliamentary supremacy would be in tune with Ubuntu thinking to some extent, because it is almost amenable to flexibility. It is always amenable to interrogation in a way that is different from this one that is fixed as a god.
But this, Professor Ramos, takes us to a very controversial proposal that the apartheid regime was closer to Ubuntu than the post-apartheid.
I don't think that we must forget this one. We mustn't forget that everything was not apartheid, because apartheid in South Africa was really born in 1948. But the problem that we are talking about predates 1948. So from the point of view of history, even apartheid can just be put in brackets, you know? It was the worst and whatever, but you know, it was the continuation of the same thing by other means. So I don't think the principle I'm speaking of really has to do with, therefore apartheid was better. One cannot infer that. When I'm looking just at the principle, What I want to say is this, that this principle of parliamentary supremacy, at least on the face of it, preserves the idea that the people are the sovereign. The people are the sovereign. It preserves that. And therefore, because the people are the sovereign, they will be able to declare and make the law through their representatives in parliament. Okay, one. This one transfers sovereignty from the people to the constitution. There is a different, it's a shift of paradigm. It's a complete paradigm change.
I agree.
Exactly, and this is what I'm questioning at two levels. At the political level, I want to ask, why is it that parliamentary supremacy was correct most of the time? Even under the 1983 constitution in this country, parliamentary supremacy was correct. I'm mentioning specifically the 1983 constitution because some of the thinkers and advisors on that constitution actually call it a racial federation. In other words, what in South African terminology is called white, Indian, and colored. They were together in the 1983 constitution. It was a racial federation because they did not have territorial claims. That was the implication. The Indian does not have a territorial claim to South Africa, so we cannot put him in an Indian stand. The colored doesn't have a territorial claim, so we can't put them in a colored stand. Okay, whites own everything, they will divide it by the mercy of God to everybody else. And that's why they divided it and they sent it, they gave it to the so-called Bantu, the Bantustans. I must mention with emphasis that I surely do not subscribe to the term colored. It is a political device to confuse issues. I can come to that later. Okay. But I really don't like the term colored. It is unjustified. Okay. Now, the point I'm moving at is politically, when they now decide, we want the Bantus to become part and parcel of this whole process of new constitution making. When the Bantus come, we must do something now. We must abandon this principle that the people are sovereign, and now persuade them to accept the principle that the constitution is supreme. That is why it becomes also a God who is absolute, who can tell you before time what is good for you. If you are not sure of what is good for you, please come to me. I am the court. I will tell you what is good for you. Forever like that, that cannot be consistent with Ubuntu. It cannot. Truth is ever negotiable, ever changing. It is ever, and because it is linked inseparably to justice, a constitution that is designed to preempt the demands of justice in advance can never surely be consistent with Ubuntu. It can never be. First, in its character as an ism. Second, in its ethical dimension as a pretext that it has all truth about what is just. This is problematical.
But your argument is even stronger. Is the argument that in fact this constitution, and you mentioned that in one of your texts, in fact transmuted unjust privileges into rights.
Precisely.
And this is the core of the matter. That is the core of the violation of Ubuntu philosophy. In your
Exactly.
view.
This is exactly this transmutation, which is now taking refuge in a constitution that may not be questioned.
But now
You see, so now the question is precisely there, that you see philosophically and ethically, it is unsustainable. The exclusion of Ubuntu by those who thought about this exclusion, probably, and this is giving them perhaps more credit than they deserve, but probably it was because they recognized exactly that if we allow Ubuntu to speak in the new constitutional dispensation, in other words, to really speak its authenticity and to really speak its mind, then even this transmutation will no longer be there. The transmutation of injustice, privileges, are now transmuted into rights. And therefore, you are invited into human rights discourse. This invitation is false. That's why I'm saying Ubuntu is concerned about truth. So the fallacy of this invitation is one thing that is recognized. The injustice that goes together with this invitation invites instead a challenge to this principle of constitutional supremacy, because it is purely a matter of strategy and tactics.
Yeah,
If it were not a matter of strategy and tactics, if this is a so-called best constitution in the world, why is it that the UK can still respect human rights and still have the principle of parliamentary supremacy?
Let's go further, because this is fascinating. Of course, you are very much aware that your position is a very minority position.
Exactly, I'm very much aware.
Because many people think that this is a constitution and so on. That is very progressive in a way or the others. But let's do this. If there is a profound incompatibility between Ubuntu and this constitution, as you claim, then how can we understand that so many well-known lawyers, well-known philosophers, justices of the Constitutional Court, have been writing sentences, decisions in the name of Ubuntu, and Ubuntu is spoken here and there, and spoken also about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because it's about harmony, it's about the restoration of equilibrium, and so on. So it looks like there are two Ubuntus, one deep, very deep, which is the one you are talking about, and a superficial construction of Ubuntu that is going around and being subjected to many different uses, convenient to the structures of power in this context of South Africa. And this, in fact, leads me to think that you say something which I think, when I compare with the Andean and the indigenous peoples in Latin America, it's very truthful and very true. It's the idea that time never destroys truth. So the state of prescriptions, as we said, statute of limitations, can never apply. I think that from there, you develop the argument that, in fact, this constitution is still based on an unjust colonial conquest. And therefore, as long as the land is not restored and restituted to the legitimate owners of this land, this constitution is a product of conquest and not an undoing of the conquest. Is this a fair reading of your?
I believe you read me fairly, Professor. I'm grateful for that reading. I just want to clarify and emphasize a few points. You started off by suggesting, by way of question, how come that so many educated people, lawyers and what, have accepted this is really a constitution we were waiting for. It is really one of the best. I think that when we look at education in colonial and post-colonial Africa, we should not underestimate the fact that the so-called right of conquest was coupled with what I would like to call epistemicide.
Yeah.
The epistemicide...
A term I use a lot as well.
Exactly.
As is new.
Exactly. This epistemological killing of other ways of knowing and doing was not totally successful.
Of course.
But what it had done was to ensure, as people like Ali Mazrui would put it, that Western centers of knowledge, even universities and colleges at the time, were simply transmission belts. That is the expression that Mazrui is. Transmission belts of an epistemological paradigm totally foreign to Africa. This was imbibed, this was assimilated, to the point that it looked so normal that by the time you say you have a better constitution, you are in the same dialogical plane, epistemologically speaking. So you speak the same language. It is only if you apply a critique like Ngugi wa Thiong'o and other African literary writers will argue. If you begin to apply a critique aimed at decolonizing the mind,
of course.
aimed at decolonizing the mind, then you will want to pause and say, why is it that this constitution is what it is? It takes into account only one part of the history of this country, and it makes sure it is going to underline the privileges of that segment, transmute them into rights, and it is all done. And since you are speaking the same epistemological language, it becomes easy if you have not really applied your mind to it. And education is still new. In colonial Africa, very few people were educated. In decolonized Africa, still very few people are educated. Perhaps for the better, because what does it help to continue assimilating uncritically, as Bondi will say. You know, Bondi, I like very much his article, Can There Be a Latin American Philosophy? He argues very, very clearly that with this uncritical assimilation of concepts is quite a problem. I don't think South Africa and many other African countries have been exempt from this uncritical assimilation. And therefore, it doesn't surprise me when you say, I am in the minority. I recognize that. I recognize that. But being in the minority shows that at least there is reason to continue struggling, because justice and truth still have to be seen to be alive and living realities.
But it's I think to pursue this line, it's very important that we should now see what are the continuities between apartheid and post-apartheid. I'd like to discuss further that with you, but it is very important in this respect to distinguish between what you call the democratization paradigm and the decolonization paradigm.
Exactly.
The two paradigms were present in the negotiations, and in fact it is the democratization paradigm that is going to prevail. And therefore the Constitution is the product of the democratization paradigm, not of the decolonization.
Exactly.
Which implies, of course, that colonization goes on under different names, under different strategies. But in any case, are there discontinuities or that may be used for struggle? That is to say, does the Bantu people, as you would say, have now more arguments to struggle, or on the contrary, they have less arguments because, in a sense, they may be victims of the illusion that the democratization, in fact, solved also the problem of decolonization, and one is taken, the part is taken for the totality. Is it possible to think that, or?
I think I like even the point you made earlier, whether or not by advancing the argument I am advancing, am I not saying, well, the state is incompatible with Ubuntu?
Yeah.
Well, let us leave the many arguments around the concept of state aside. Whatever the state is, 2 points I think must be acknowledged. One is that the state cannot and has never come before human beings. Human beings, as Rerum Novarum would put it, always are anterior. They come before the state. So, because they come before the state, when they create one, they have just one, many intentions, but one that underlies it all is that within the state, their rights will be respected, recognized, and promoted. And Rerum Novarum goes further to argue that if the state were seen to be seen not to be doing this, then there is no reason to have one. So I follow that reasoning too, and I'm saying, since we have it as a fact, the state, it is still necessary to test it against this yardstick. Does it really recognize, respect, and promote the rights of the people? Now, at the time when I wrote the articles you refer to, indeed, democratization and decolonization were the major paradigms. But we must remember that at the very same time, democracy was already steadily being overcome by incipient democracy. So, now, we can no longer speak, even when we have a so-called democracy in 1994. We must remember that we are talking about something that has long been overtaken. Now, to show that this has long been overtaken, that's why earlier on I referred to so-called negotiations. There is a serious issue here, Professor. You know, already around 1994, Alistair Sparks published a book called Tomorrow is Another Country. Before him, of course, Pilger wrote a book called Freedom Next Time. And later on, closer to our time, Professor Sam Peter Blanche wrote another book, smallish, serious book, called Lost in Transformation. And then his colleague, Professor Esterhazy, wrote another one called Endgame. A careful study of these texts shows very clearly that even before public negotiations, there were very serious and conclusive, decisive negotiations. These books show very clearly that this was the case. I am really surprised that those mentioned by name in those texts, I have not yet heard them object to the contents of the books. So, for politicians, things reach a deniability status, if you get what I mean. And so, it is very strange that in this case, there's no deniability at all. But the books show that, in fact, there was even no need for public negotiations because everything was done and completed. All that was necessary was to declare a new constitution and things should be normal. Well, there are lots of ethical problems around that, but this is one of the points I want to make, that those negotiations, before the negotiations, actually meant that, oh, you see, we are going to secure our interests now. And they made sure that that happened. Lots of meetings in the Brenthurst, whatever, all this is mentioned. Now, after securing that, I don't think capital has the virtue of trusting someone else. So what they decided was, you also make laws which will make it possible for us to take as much money out of the country as we would like to. Even more, you must make it legally possible to decide that we now transfer our monies from the Johannesburg Stock Exchange to the London or the New York Stock Exchange. You see, again, Rachel is thinking that just in case there is a reversal of this, then our unjustly acquired privileges and wealth should be safe. So concessions were made, this thing is happening. And of course, Patrick Bond has a very interesting text on that called Global Apartheid, which shows exactly how this flight of capital was managed, how it was allowed to go. And so in a way, we live in a South Africa that is rather poor, but still the people who took and continue to take out the money are still here until the worst comes.
Many people from outside would think that Nelson Mandela conducted the transition in order to avoid a civil war. And so it was a very pragmatic type of approach to see that probably the struggle is not ended, but that's the best that we can get at this point in time. What I want to say is that there is a sense, in your view, of betrayal of an aspiration of liberation of people, and we even talk of limping sovereignty and limited sovereignty, so to say, precisely because the land was not recognized as part of the restoration of the equilibrium. But then your argument runs also in some difficulties because you say, well, the indigenous people of this country, but who are they? After all, the Bantu were invaders. The Khoisan were not the original people in these regions. Should they be the holders of the land or the Bantu people? Who are the Indian, who are the Africans? We'll come to that. But, who are the holders of the titles?
Yeah, you see, that's why I started by saying that there are problems with South African historiography. Okay, I meant exactly that. Now that you make it concrete, let me explain a little bit. South African historiography, which is exclusive, like the fact that we are excluded from the Constitution, We are excluded from having a voice in the history which claims that we just come from the north, we came almost at the same time, and so we have no title to this. And the only people who have the title are the Khoi and the San peoples. And we massacred them and so on. Well, because it is history, with a very precarious claim to objectivity, I just want to point at few aspects which show that this objectivity borders on the ridiculous. Mm-hmm. Why is it that we can all migrate from the north? And why is it that you are completely silent about the fact that only the Khoi and the San people can grow like grass from the soil of South Africa? And not the whole South Africa, mind you, but just from part of South Africa, the Khoi and the San people grew like grass, like natural vegetation. The rest of us must come from somewhere. They don't have to come from anywhere else. That is objectivity in historiography.
In my visits to South Africa, I see really this kind of low-intensity civil war. And I tell you two stories because I think it's important for us to say these small things. One thing was that I was going with my friend and a colleague, Chepo Mandligosi. We were going from Port Elizabeth to Rhodes, to Grahamstown. Mm-hmm. And we could see these huge tracts of land for gaming, for safaris and so on. And then I was talking with people that are in struggles, people of the United People, Unemployment People movement, people that are struggling to get dignity, because in these townships we have more than 50% of unemployment. Mm-hmm. People have no land for nothing. So for me, this, after 20 years after the apartheid, and one would expect that at least some transformation on this shortage of land on these places and all those huge tracts of land, that one would think, even not taking your maximalist argument, that is to say, land back to the conquered people, right? Even if we wouldn't take that extreme, an agrarian reform strong enough that would really restore to all the peasants land and to people in urban cities adequate land for them to till, build their houses, have their gardens, have their agriculture. Why is this not possible? Why is that the Constitution allows for this injustice? What do you think of that?
I think that there are several layers again to this. We spoke earlier about a lack of education. It's too general. You see, Professor, the transition to constitutional supremacy was not accidental at all. One of the Constitution's provisions is that you may not alienate or expropriate the property of another person. So the vast tracts of land that you have seen are really so-called private property of A, B, C, and D. And if you want to make a law to expropriate them, that law must face the test of the Constitution. Is it going to be expropriation with and without, or without a compensation? Is it expropriation based on compelling state interest, if I may use one legal expression here? So you see, the Constitutional Court, the Constitution will have to decide that. Not you as the legislator, not you as the representative of the people who are suffering. You do not have the power to make law in substance which may not be challenged in the courts. It will and can be challenged. So the leadership, if it really knows then it must address. If it doesn't address the problem, then its claim to knowledge is, to put it very mildly, questionable. And therefore, it calls into question also the ethics of the leadership. Now, when we go to Nkrumah, to whom you referred, and I'm glad you noted that, I'm aware he had many political mistakes, like any other politician. But you see, Nkrumah was steadfast on principle. He, for example, was promised so-called foreign aid from the United States. And then he published the book, Neo-Colonialism.
Yes.
And of course, the foreign aid was withdrawn the next morning. But he didn't say, oh, I retract everything I have written so that you can give the foreign aid back. Because the truth that he stated there is truth that is related to justice that is required. And we know that his death was not accidental. So, I mean, especially his removal from office was not accidental. And this is why I'm saying, when you have a leadership that is actually amenable to the interest of big capital, to democracy in our day. Democracy is gone, let's not pretend otherwise. It is gone. It may just come as a kind of ceremonial Muppet show every 5 or 4 years, but it is gone. Democracy is, as you rightly pointed out, the issue now. Now, when this thing happens, when we are going to have a situation in which you must choose as a leader, knowingly, you know that if I make an option to march along with the Democrats, I'm actually saying I am killing everybody softly. You as a person have to ask yourself the question, is this killing justified? Even before the people make their own judgment. You have to ask yourself, especially because of your knowledge and understanding of things, am I entering into this, and is this killing justified?
I agree with you. I always admired, that book by Nkrumah was a very important book, and it's still very important.
Still very important.
But we are at a different time, and sometimes your argument may lead us to very surprising conclusions. One would think, from your reading and from your text, that Mugabe is one of those leaders like Nkrumah, who is not compromising on principle and is restoring the land to the owners. As you know, here in South Africa and in many parts of Africa or in the world, many people say, well, South Africa, let it be as it is, because they are scared that something like Zimbabwe would occur here in South Africa. Besides, Mugabe is not a model in a sense, internal democratic. I think that if we take your two distinctions, which I think is a very productive distinction, democratization processes and decolonization processes, one would think that Mugabe fares better in the decolonization process than probably in the democratic process. I don't know. It's just an hypothesis.
Yeah.
But the situation in Zimbabwe is not a situation that you'd like to see here, or not?
I'm glad you raised that question. Let me just in brackets say that, even if we may not talk decolonization in the strict sense, in the case I want to refer to now, you may recall that after the fall of the Tsar in Russia, France demanded that the new regime should pay the foreign debt that the Tsar owed. And of course, the new regime has told them, if you can find the Tsar, please get the money from them. And over the years, France is trying still. Do you remember the debt? And the Russians always tell them, find the Tsar, and the Tsar will pay. Now, that, I think, should tell us something, just something, about being able to stand your ground, one point. When we go to Mugabe, I'm glad you say you went to Rhodes. Of course, the name itself of that university is in honor of the man who's supposed to have established Rhodesia. Now, Rhodes is a name, but a name that represented capital then, that still represents capital now. The capital that controls in Zimbabwe has got different names, but it is the same capital that controls here. Mugabe is like many other leaders, many other human beings, and many other politicians. He also has mistakes, many mistakes, political mistakes, just like Nkrumah had, just like Nyerere had. I just want to mention in parentheses that it is interesting that these three leaders have been or are Catholics. Just in parentheses.
We'll come to that later
Exactly,
on. We'll come to that.
Right. So you see, and then with all these mistakes that Mugabe has, which I really censure myself, I incidentally lived and taught in Zimbabwe for 4 years. So some of these things I noticed, I heard about, I was able to say, this is not right, what Mugabe is doing. So I'm not saying that Mugabe is doing everything right. But what surprised me last year was the fear that you are expressing. Last year we had a World Congress of Philosophy in Greece, and this argument that you raised came up. And there was almost conclusion, and the session was about to end. And the people were quite happy to say, yes, indeed, what happens in Zimbabwe should not be allowed to happen anywhere in Africa and even South Africa. So I raised my hands, I said, oh, I'm so sorry. I see that the session is about to close, but this conclusion is seriously contestable. Well, please tell me, because as far as I can see, Mugabe is fighting Rhodesian economy in Zimbabwe in order to establish a Zimbabwean economy. From that point of view, it is difficult to say that Mugabe is actually destroying a Zimbabwean economy, because an economy of Zimbabwe does not exist. It is in the making. It will exist after he has overcome the Rhodesian, the enduring Rhodesian economy which he is fighting now. If you doubt this, just do tell me of any single African country which at independence also at the same time obtained economic independence. If you can point at one country like that, then for sure Mugabe is doing wrong. If you can't, Mugabe is in principle and in terms of history correct to struggle against the persisting economy of Rhodesia, which is killing the Zimbabweans, and he wants to establish a Zimbabwean economy. Of course, he will not be left alone, just like Nyerere was not left alone to pursue Ujamaa, because the consequences of a successful Ujamaa would be unpalatable to capitalism. So, when we look at it that way, I can say that there is no substance in saying Mugabe is destroying the economy of Zimbabwe, because that one is yet to be born. So how can he destroy what does not exist? I don't think so.